started on a night like any other, a deep silence hanging heavy in the empty house. A silence so profound that every creak of the floorboards and hum of the refrigerator seemed magnified 1,000-fold. I had always been comfortable being home alone, reveling in the solitude, but this night felt different. Like the darkness itself was alive, watching. It began subtly, almost imperceptibly, as I sat in the living room binge-watching my favorite show. The faintest sound of shuffling feet upstairs made me pause. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling or my overactive imagination playing tricks on me. But then came the soft thud, deliberate and paced, as if someone was walking. My heart clenched, but I shook it off. "It's just the wind," I muttered, though the words did little to calm my nerves. I grabbed the remote and turned up the volume, drowning out the whispers of unease in my mind. Minutes later, the lights flickered. Not the casual dimming of a faulty bulb, but a rhythmic, almost deliberate pulse that set my teeth on edge. Still, I refused to panic. Power surge, I told myself, even though the air carried an oppressive charge that made the hairs on my neck stand on end. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, the sudden vibration startling me. A text from an unknown number. It read, "Are you alone?" A cold shiver raced down my spine as I stared at the screen. My first instinct was to ignore it, but curiosity, or perhaps a morbid need for reassurance, got the better of me. I replied with shaky fingers, "Who is this?" No answer. The seconds dragged into minutes, the silence now deafening. Then another text, "I can see you." My blood ran cold. The living room was brightly lit, the curtains drawn tightly shut. It had to be a prank, some cruel joke by a friend who knew I was home alone. I jumped to my feet and double-checked the locks on the doors and windows, my movements frantic. But deep down, a gnawing fear was taking root, its icy tendrils wrapping around my mind. Suddenly, the TV screen froze, the static hissing loudly. My reflection stared back at me from the glass, pale and wide-eyed. Behind me, a shadow flickered, tall, human-like, but distorted, its edges rippling as though it didn't belong to this world. I spun around, heart pounding, but the room was empty. The shadow, however, lingered in the periphery of my vision, always just out of focus, mocking me with its presence. Panic gripped me as I retreated to the kitchen, clutching a knife for some semblance of protection. The air grew heavier, each breath a struggle. The text buzzed again, "Come upstairs." My stomach churned as I glanced toward the darkened staircase. The sound of shuffling feet resumed, louder now, accompanied by a faint, wheezing breath. My mind screamed to run, but my legs betrayed me, frozen in place. Another thud, then another, each step echoing like a death knell. Against my better judgment, I crept toward the stairs, the knife trembling in my hand. The light above flickered violently as I ascended, each step a battle against an invisible force pressing down on me. At the top, the hallway stretched impossibly long, the doors to the bedrooms yawning open like hungry mouths. A low, guttural growl emanated from the farthest room. My hand tightened around the knife as I edged closer, my heart hammering in my chest. The growl morphed into a whisper, guttural and wet, as though spoken through a mouthful of mud. "I've been waiting." The door slammed shut in front of me, the sound reverberating through the house. The handle was ice cold under my touch as I forced it open, my pulse roaring in my ears. Inside, the room was dark, the only illumination coming from a small, flickering candle on the floor. Around it were symbols scrawled in a substance that looked horrifyingly like blood. In the corner, a figure crouched, its limbs unnaturally long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. Its eyes glowed faintly, reflecting the candlelight as it turned to face me. The smell of decay filled the air, making me gag. "Why are you here?" I stammered, though I didn't expect an answer. It let out a chilling laugh, a sound that echoed inside my skull, and lunged. I screamed, swinging the knife blindly, but my hand passed through it as though it were made of smoke. It wrapped around me, its touch freezing, suffocating. As whispers filled my head, dark promises, threats, and secrets I couldn't comprehend. I stumbled back, crashing into the wall. The candle went out, plunging the room into complete darkness. I don't remember how I escaped, but I found myself outside, the house looming behind me like a living entity. The windows were dark, yet I could feel eyes watching me from every shadow. My phone buzzed again. "You can't leave." I dropped it, my only thought to run, to get as far away as possible. But as I sprinted down the street, the whispers followed, growing louder, more insistent, until they were all I could hear. To this day, I don't know what happened in that house or why it chose me, but I know one thing: I am never alone. It began on a dreary, rain-soaked evening, the kind where the skies seemed to weep endlessly, drowning the world in gray and gloom. I was home alone, a rare occurrence, as my parents had gone to visit my aunt in the next town. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic tapping of rain against the windows and the occasional distant rumble of thunder. At first, I relished the solitude, curling up on the couch with a blanket and a cup of tea, the soft glow of a lamp casting warm, flickering shadows on the walls. But as the night deepened, an unease settled over me, a heavy, inexplicable sense that I wasn't as alone as I thought. It started subtly, almost innocently, the feeling of being watched. I chalked it up to paranoia, perhaps fueled by the storm outside or the horror movie I had foolishly left playing in the background. But then, the shadows seemed to grow darker, shifting slightly as if they had a life of their own. I glanced toward the large mirror hanging above the fireplace, and for the briefest moment, I thought I saw something move, a flicker of motion that didn't belong to me. My breath caught, but when I looked again, it was just my reflection, wide-eyed and pale. I laughed nervously, shaking my head. "Get a grip," I muttered to myself, trying to dispel the growing tension. I decided to distract myself, moving to the kitchen to make popcorn. The sound of kernels popping provided some comfort, a reminder of normalcy. But as I poured the popcorn into a bowl, I heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound, like the creak of a floorboard upstairs. I froze, straining to listen. The house settled all the time, I reasoned. It was old and prone to making noises. Still, my heart began to race as the sound came again, louder this time, like slow, deliberate footsteps. My gaze darted to the ceiling as I backed away from the counter, clutching the bowl like it was some kind of shield. "Hello," I called out, my voice trembling. The silence that followed was deafening, thick with anticipation. I told myself it was nothing, just the house playing tricks on me, but every nerve in my body screamed otherwise. I grabbed a kitchen knife, the cold metal reassuring in my hand, and slowly made my way to the base of the staircase. The darkness at the top seemed impenetrable, a void that threatened to swallow me whole. My phone buzzed in my pocket, startling me. I fumbled to pull it out, my fingers trembling. A text from an unknown number appeared on the screen. "Don't go upstairs." My blood turned to ice. My first instinct was to run, to flee the house entirely, but something rooted me to the spot. A morbid curiosity, or perhaps the sheer disbelief that this could be real. I typed back, "Who is this?" My hands shook as I waited for a reply, but none came. Instead, the footsteps resumed, heavier now, as if something or someone was pacing directly above me. Summoning every ounce of courage I could muster, I started up the stairs, my heart pounding so loudly I was sure it would burst. Each step felt like an eternity, the creaking wood beneath my feet echoing through the house. When I reached the top, the hallway stretched before me, impossibly long, with doors to the bedrooms and bathrooms standing ajar. A cold draft blew through, carrying with it the faint scent of something rotten. My eyes were drawn to the end of the hall, where the mirror in my parents' bedroom stood partially visible through the doorway. It reflected a sliver of the hallway, distorted and dark. As I approached, the air grew colder, my breath visible in the dim light. The mirror seemed to hum faintly, a low vibration that I felt in my chest. When I stepped into the room, the smell hit me full force, decay and something sickly sweet. My reflection stared back at me, wide-eyed and trembling. But as I moved closer, I noticed something horrifying. My reflection wasn't mimicking my movements. It stood still, watching me with a faint, menacing smile. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my legs refused to move. Then it spoke. Its voice was my own, but distorted, layered with something guttural and wrong. "Why did you come up here?" it asked, the smile stretching unnaturally wide. My knife slipped from my grasp, clattering to the floor as I stumbled backward. The reflection didn't flinch. Instead, it stepped closer to the glass, its eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. "You shouldn't have looked," it hissed. The glass began to ripple like water, and before I could react, a hand burst through the surface, skeletal and blackened, reaching for me. I screamed, scrambling out of the room and slamming the door shut behind me. The house erupted with noise, footsteps, whispers, and the relentless pounding of something trying to break through the door. I bolted down the stairs, my heart in my throat, but as I reached the living room, I stopped dead. Every mirror, every reflective surface in the house now showed that thing, staring at me with its twisted grin. It whispered my name, over and over, growing louder with each passing second. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but the screen was blank except for the reflection of my terrified face. The whispers turned to screams, a cacophony of voices echoing in my head. The last thing I remember before everything went black was the sensation of cold hands wrapping around my throat, pulling me toward the nearest mirror. When I woke up, the house was silent again, the storm outside long gone. But the mirrors, they were all covered, every single one. I moved out the next day, but sometimes in the corner of my eye, I still see it, the watcher waiting for me to look again. It was the kind of silence that felt alive, pulsating in the dim glow of my living room lamp, a fragile bubble of warmth against the oppressive darkness that pressed against the windows. Home alone for the weekend, I'd initially enjoyed the solitude, spending the early hours binge-watching crime documentaries and stuffing my face with snacks. But as the night stretched on, a peculiar weight settled over the house, a sensation like unseen eyes tracing my every movement. At first, I dismissed it as paranoia, the product of too much caffeine and a vivid imagination. But then subtle things began to shift. It started with the clock on the wall, its hands jerking to a halt at 2:37 a.m., the faint ticking sound replaced by an eerie, low hum that seemed to emanate from within the walls. I laughed nervously, telling myself it was just a power glitch, though the lights and television hummed along without interruption. My attention wandered to the hardwood floor beneath my feet, which creaked faintly, not with the randomness of an old house settling but with deliberate, measured intervals as though someone or something was pacing directly beneath me. I shook off the unease, heading to the kitchen for a drink. But the moment I stepped into the kitchen, the floorboards groaned, louder now, and this time unmistakably accompanied by the sound of something scraping. A sharp, grating noise that sent chills racing down my spine. I froze, my heart hammering as the sound seemed to follow me, moving beneath the floor wherever I went. "It's just the house," I whispered aloud, as though speaking would somehow banish the growing terror. But deep down, I knew it wasn't. The air grew colder as I made my way back to the living room, clutching a glass of water so tightly that my knuckles ached. That's when I saw it. A shadow, small and quick, darting across the periphery of my vision. I spun around, but nothing was there. Just the dimly lit corridor stretching toward the front door, its shadows seeming deeper than they had any right to be. My phone buzzed on the coffee table, a welcome distraction from the oppressive quiet. Picking it up, I saw a single message from an unknown number. "They hear you." My stomach dropped, the words echoing in my mind like a warning bell. I fumbled to reply, typing out a shaky, "Who is this?" But before I could hit send, the phone screen went black, and an icy gust of wind blew through the room, extinguishing the lamp. I was plunged into darkness. The scraping beneath the floorboards grew louder, more frantic, as though something was clawing its way toward me. My breath hitched as I stumbled toward the wall, feeling for the light switch, When the overhead light flickered on, I wished it hadn't. The floorboards in the center of the room were bulging upward, trembling as though under immense pressure. And then, with a sickening crack, a gap split open. At first, there was nothing but darkness, but soon two pale, impossibly long hands emerged, their fingers tipped with jagged, dirt-encrusted nails. They gripped the edges of the gap, pulling something up. A figure cloaked in shadow, its face obscured except for two hollow, glowing eyes that seemed to pierce straight into my soul. I backed away, my legs trembling. As the thing climbed out of the floor, its movements unnaturally fluid, like smoke given form. It stood there impossibly tall, its head nearly grazing the ceiling, and though it made no sound, I could feel its intent, a malevolent hunger that made my skin crawl. My instinct screamed at me to run, but my legs refused to obey. The figure moved closer, and as it did, the shadows in the room grew darker, denser, swallowing the edges of my vision. Desperate, I grabbed a heavy vase from the coffee table and hurled it at the creature. The vase passed through it as though it weren't there, shattering against the wall behind it. The figure paused, tilting its head in a way that seemed almost curious, before it raised one of its spindly arms. The shadows around me sprang to life, coiling like serpents. One wrapped around my wrist, another around my ankle, cold as death and impossibly strong. I fought against them, but it was like struggling against steel chains. The creature leaned closer, and for the first time, it spoke. Not with words, but with a voice that invaded my mind. A cacophony of whispers that made my ears ring and my vision blur. "You called us," it said, though I had no idea what it meant. My thoughts raced, trying to remember anything I might have done to summon this nightmare. The Ouija board I'd played with years ago, the cursed urban legends I'd read online, but none of it made sense. As the creature loomed over me, I realized it didn't matter. Whatever this thing was, it had already decided my fate. With a final surge of adrenaline, I yanked myself free from the shadowy restraints and bolted for the front door. The house seemed to warp around me, the walls narrowing, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The door was just feet away when the shadows surged again, slamming it shut. I screamed, pounding on the wood, but it was like hitting solid stone. The creature was behind me now, so close I could feel its icy breath on my neck. I turned to face it, tears streaming down my face as it reached for me. Its touch was colder than anything I'd ever felt, and as its fingers closed around my arm, the world began to dissolve into darkness. I woke up hours later, or maybe days, lying on the floor of the living room. The house was silent again, the gap in the floorboards gone, as though it had never been there. But the chill lingered, and the shadows seemed to watch me, waiting. I didn't stay long after that. I packed a bag and left, unable to bear the thought of spending another night in that house. But even now, miles away, I can still feel it. The scratching beneath the floorboards, the weight of unseen eyes, and the cold, unyielding grip of the shadows that never truly let go. It was supposed to be an uneventful night, just me and the creaking old house I'd grown up in. My parents had left to attend a family emergency, leaving me in charge for the first time. I was excited at first, thrilled by the prospect of being in control of the entire house. The evening passed uneventfully as I lounged in the living room, flipping through channels on the television. Around 10 p.m., the first strange sound echoed, a faint, dragging noise coming from upstairs. I froze, listening intently, convincing myself it was just the pipes or the old floorboards adjusting to the cold night air. Yet, deep down, something felt wrong, an undercurrent of dread that I couldn't shake. Ignoring the gnawing unease, I locked all the doors and checked the windows. The house was sealed tight, and I laughed nervously at how my imagination was playing tricks on me. But when I returned to the living room, the TV had switched itself off, leaving the room eerily quiet. My heart skipped a beat as I saw something move in the reflection of the dark screen, a flicker of a shadow that didn't belong to me. I spun around, knife-sharp panic taking hold, but the room was empty. Trying to shake off the feeling, I decided to head to bed early. I locked my bedroom door and crawled under the covers, but sleep eluded me. The silence pressed against my ears, and every tiny noise, the hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, felt amplified. Then, I heard it again, the dragging sound, closer this time, like something heavy being pulled across the floor. My heart thundered in my chest as I strained to hear, my mind racing with every possibility. Summoning courage, I tiptoed to the door and pressed my ear against it. The sound stopped abruptly, as though whoever or whatever had been making it knew I was listening. For several minutes, I stood there, paralyzed, before finally opening the door a crack. The hallway stretched out before me, dimly lit by the flickering bulb at the far end. Nothing moved, but the air felt heavy, oppressive, as though the house itself was holding its breath. I decided to investigate, gripping my phone tightly with the flashlight on. As I crept down the hall, the temperature seemed to drop, and the shadows along the walls seemed to lengthen unnaturally. I reached the staircase and peered down into the darkness below. That's when I saw it, a figure standing at the base of the stairs. It wasn't fully human. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnatural, and its face was obscured by a veil of shadows. It stood completely still, yet I could feel its gaze locked onto me. My breath hitched, and I stumbled backward, nearly dropping my phone. When I blinked, the figure was gone, leaving only the suffocating silence behind. Retreating to my room, I locked the door and slid under the covers, trembling. The house remained eerily quiet for what felt like hours until a soft tapping started at my window. My room was on the second floor, and the thought of something or someone being out there made my blood run cold. Gathering what little courage I had left, I approached the window slowly. I drew back the curtain, and for a split second, I saw a face. Gaunt, pale, with hollow, unblinking eyes staring back at me. I screamed and stumbled away, but when I looked again, the face was gone, leaving only the faint imprint of a hand on the glass. Desperate, I called my parents, but the call wouldn't connect. The screen glitched and distorted, and I heard faint whispers coming through the speaker, voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I threw the phone onto the bed, my heart pounding, as the whispers grew louder, filling the room. The lights flickered, and the door handle began to turn slowly, though I had locked it. The handle stopped, and a low, guttural growl emanated from the other side. I backed into the corner, clutching a makeshift weapon, a heavy lamp, and waited, sweat dripping down my face. The growling stopped, replaced by silence, but I didn't dare move. Minutes passed like hours before I finally mustered the courage to open the door. The hallway was empty, but the air carried a faint, acrid smell, like burnt hair. As I stepped out, I noticed deep scratches along the walls, marks that hadn't been there before. The house felt alive, the walls pulsating with a faint rhythm, like a heartbeat. I decided to leave, to run out into the night and never look back. But as I reached the front door, I found it wouldn't budge. The locks wouldn't turn, and the windows were impossible to open. It was as though the house itself had trapped me. Panic took over, and I screamed for help, but my voice seemed to vanish into the oppressive silence. Then I felt it, a hand on my shoulder. Spinning around, I came face to face with the shadow figure, its hollow eyes burning into mine. It whispered my name, its voice a raspy echo that sent chills down my spine. Before I could react, it lunged, and everything went black. I woke up in my room, drenched in sweat, as though no time had passed. But the scratches on the walls were still there, and the faint smell of burning lingered. My parents came home the next morning, and I didn't tell them what happened. But every night since, I've heard the dragging sound, growing closer and closer, and I know that whatever was in the house that night is still here, watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. Being home alone never bothered me before. I usually enjoyed the stillness, the kind that wraps around you like a warm blanket, where the only sounds are the occasional creak of the house and the faint hum of distant traffic. But tonight, something felt different. as if the walls were holding their breath, waiting for something to happen. I had just settled into the couch with a bowl of popcorn and a movie when I heard the first sound. A faint, almost imperceptible scraping coming from the basement. I froze, straining to hear over the TV. It came again, a dragging noise, like something heavy being pulled across the concrete floor. My mind raced through logical explanations. Maybe a raccoon had gotten in, or perhaps it was just the old furnace acting up. But something about the sound felt wrong, deliberate, as though it wanted me to hear. Against my better judgment, I decided to check it out. Grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen, I crept toward the basement door, each step heavier than the last. The door groaned open, revealing the yawning blackness below. I flicked on the flashlight and descended slowly, the beam cutting through the stale air. The basement was cluttered, as always, with stacks of boxes and old furniture casting long, eerie shadows. I scanned the room, my heart pounding, but there was nothing out of the ordinary. Just as I was about to retreat, the light flickered, and I felt it. A shift in the air, cold and electric, like static crawling across my skin. Then came the voice, low and guttural, whispering my name. My blood turned to ice. I spun around, the flashlight shaking in my grip, but the room was empty. The voice came again, this time closer, rasping words I couldn't understand. Panic took over, and I bolted up the stairs, slamming the door behind me. Back in the living room, I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, a trick of the mind amplified by the solitude. But then the TV turned off on its own, leaving me in darkness. The silence was deafening, pressing against my ears like a physical weight. I grabbed my phone, but the screen wouldn't turn on. It was dead, even though I had charged it fully just hours ago. The sound of footsteps echoed from the hallway, slow and deliberate. I clutched the flashlight, its beam now dim and unreliable, and turned toward the noise. The footsteps stopped, replaced by the faint sound of breathing, coming from just around the corner. Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped forward, only to find the hallway empty. But the breathing persisted, growing louder, as if something unseen was standing right in front of me. I stumbled backward, tripping over the edge of the rug, and landed hard on the floor. That's when I saw it. A shadow that didn't belong, darker than the surrounding darkness, slithering across the ceiling like smoke. It moved with an unnatural fluidity, its edges flickering like the flame of a dying candle. My throat tightened as it descended, pooling on the floor before taking shape. A figure tall and impossibly thin, its face a featureless void. It reached out with elongated fingers, and I scrambled to my feet, my legs barely supporting me as I ran to the front door. The lock wouldn't turn, the door refusing to budge no matter how hard I pulled. I could feel it behind me, its presence a suffocating weight. Desperate, I turned toward the stairs and raced up to my bedroom, slamming the door shut and shoving a chair under the knob. My heart was a drumbeat in my ears as I crouched in the corner, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The whispers began again, seeping through the walls, a chorus of voices speaking in a language I didn't understand. The room grew colder, the air thick with the stench of decay. The shadows on the walls twisted and writhed, forming grotesque shapes that seemed to reach for me. Then, the whispers stopped, replaced by a single, bone-chilling word: run. The chair slid away from the door on its own, and it swung open slowly. The hallway beyond was shrouded in darkness, but I could see the figure standing there, its head cocked to one side as if studying me. I backed away, my chest tightening with dread, until I was pressed against the window. With nowhere left to go, I grabbed the lamp from my bedside table and hurled it at the figure. It shattered, the room plunging into darkness. When I flicked the flashlight back on, the figure was gone. But the relief was short-lived. The walls began to close in, the room warping and twisting as if the house itself was alive. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, and I realized they were coming from inside my head. I clamped my hands over my ears, but it was no use. The figure appeared again, this time right in front of me, its void-like face inches from mine. It reached out and everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the living room floor, the house eerily silent. The TV was on, playing static, and my phone was back on the coffee table, fully charged. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, but then I saw it. A single, blackened handprint on the wall, and the faint sound of laughter echoing from the basement. Being home alone wasn't supposed to be a big deal. I'd done it plenty of times before. My parents had left for a weekend trip, and I thought I'd enjoy the peace and quiet. The house was large but old, with creaky floors and walls that seemed to whisper when the wind blew. At first, I didn't think much of the strange noises. Random thuds in the attic, faint tapping against the windows. It was an old house after all. But as the hours passed, the normal sounds began to feel intentional. The thudding became rhythmic, almost like footsteps pacing back and forth above my head. I brushed it off, turning up the volume on the TV to drown out the unease gnawing at the edges of my mind. Around midnight, the power went out. The sudden darkness was suffocating, the only light coming from my phone's screen. I scrambled to find a flashlight, cursing under my breath, when I heard it, a soft, deliberate knock at the front door. It wasn't loud or urgent, but it echoed through the house like a gunshot. I froze, heart pounding, and waited, hoping it was just the wind. The knock came again, slower this time, almost mocking. I crept toward the door, every instinct screaming at me to run in the opposite direction. Peering through the peephole, I saw nothing, just the empty porch bathed in pale moonlight. No wind, no movement. The knock came again, louder now, and I nearly jumped out of my skin. Gathering what little courage I had, I cracked the door open, flashlight shaking in my hand. The porch was empty. No footprints in the fresh snow, no sign anyone had been there. Shutting the door, I locked it tight, double-checked the windows, and tried to convince myself it was all in my head. But then the knocking started again, this time from the back door. I spun around, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness, and sprinted to the kitchen. The back door was glass, and beyond it, the yard stretched into a dense line of trees. But again, there was nothing, no figure, no movement, just the oppressive stillness of the night. I pulled the curtain shut, heart racing, and tried calling my parents. No signal. The power outage must have disrupted the cell tower, or at least that's what I told myself. Then I heard it, the faint sound of breathing. Not my own, it was heavier, labored, and it was coming from inside the house. Panic surged as I grabbed a kitchen knife and crept toward the living room. The breathing grew louder, closer, as though someone or something was following me. The flashlight flickered, casting long, shifting shadows on the walls. That's when I saw it. A figure stood at the far end of the hallway, just out of reach of the light. It was tall, impossibly so, with limbs that seemed too long and joints that bent at unnatural angles. Its head tilted to the side, and though its face was obscured by the shadows, I felt its gaze bore into me, cold and relentless. I backed away slowly, my breath hitching, and the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching. Then, with a sudden, horrifying speed, it vanished. One moment there, the next gone, as though it had dissolved into the darkness. The knife felt useless in my hand as I stumbled back to the kitchen, slamming the door behind me. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Maybe it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flickering flashlight. But deep down, I knew better. The house was alive with sound now. The thudding in the attic was louder, joined by scratching along the walls and faint whispers that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Desperate, I decided to leave, to run out into the snow and find help. But when I opened the front door, the world outside had changed. The streetlights were out, the familiar neighborhood gone, replaced by an endless expanse of trees shrouded in fog. The air was thick, heavy with a metallic tang that made my skin crawl. I slammed the door shut, realizing with a sinking dread that I was trapped. The whispers grew louder, forming words I couldn't understand, a language that felt ancient and wrong. Then the lights came back on, flooding the house with a sickly yellow glow. Relief was short-lived as I saw them. Figures standing in every doorway, every corner, their eyes glinting like polished obsidian. They didn't move, didn't speak, just stared, their presence suffocating. I screamed, backing into the living room, and that's when I noticed the mirror above the fireplace. It was cracked down the center, and in its fractured surface I saw myself, but not as I was. My reflection was pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes and a twisted grin that didn't belong to me. It moved on its own, raising a hand to wave mockingly. Even as I stood frozen in terror, the figures closed in, their faces blank and featureless, their hands outstretched. I swung the knife wildly, but it passed through them like smoke. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me was my reflection stepping out of the mirror, its grin widening as it reached for me. When I woke up, the house was quiet again. The power was back, the mirrors unbroken, and the snow outside undisturbed. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the presence lingering just out of sight, watching, waiting. The house had changed, or maybe I had. Either way, I knew one thing for certain. I was never truly alone, and I never would be again. The night was like any other, quiet, unassuming, and enveloped in the comfortable solitude I had grown to appreciate. My parents were out for the weekend, leaving me alone in the creaking, old house we'd lived in for years, its walls soaked with the memories of generations. At first, I relished the freedom, sprawling on the couch with a bowl of chips and the glow of the television painting flickering patterns on the darkened walls. But as the hours stretched into the depths of the night, a peculiar unease began to settle in. A feeling like being watched, though I was alone. I brushed it off, attributing it to the eerie charm of our aged home. But then the noises began. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. A faint tapping, like raindrops against the window. I dismissed it, but then came a slow, deliberate knock from somewhere upstairs. I froze, every hair on my body standing on end. My eyes darted toward the ceiling, and my breath hitched as I listened. But the house had fallen silent again. Telling myself it was just the house settling, I tried to focus back on the TV, but my unease grew when the knock came again, this time louder and closer, as though someone, or something, was moving down the hallway above. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood, gripping my phone tightly, its dim screen offering little comfort. I texted my parents, but the message didn't go through. The no-signal icon taunted me. I laughed nervously, convincing myself it was a coincidence, and decided to investigate. After all, I was home alone, right? Armed with a flashlight, I ascended the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The hallway stretched before me, dimly lit by the moonlight filtering through the curtains. At the far end, the door to my parents' bedroom was slightly ajar, swaying gently as though nudged by an unseen hand. I swallowed hard and stepped forward, calling out, "Hello? Is anyone there?" My voice sounded small and fragile in the oppressive silence. As I approached the door, a cold draft brushed past me, carrying with it a faint, foul odor like something rotting. I hesitated but forced myself to push the door open. The room was empty, its shadows pooling in the corners like ink. I scanned the room with my flashlight, my pulse racing, but there was nothing out of place. Just as I turned to leave, the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. I screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. My shaking hand fumbled with the doorknob, but it wouldn't budge, as if locked from the outside. Panic surged through me, and I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but the house seemed to swallow my cries. Then, I heard it, a low, guttural growl emanating from the closet. My flashlight flickered, and my breath hitched as the growl turned into a deep, ragged breathing, like something enormous struggling to contain itself. The closet door began to rattle, the knob twisting violently, as though something trapped inside was desperate to escape. Paralyzed with fear, I pressed myself against the wall, my eyes locked on the closet as it burst open. But instead of a monster, there was nothing. just a gaping void of darkness that seemed to stretch forever. A sudden, bone-chilling cold swept over me, and I felt a presence, intangible but oppressive, like being smothered by invisible hands. The shadows in the room began to move, converging on me, their whispers growing louder until they became a deafening roar. Just as I thought I couldn't bear it any longer, the door flew open, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. I bolted down the stairs, my legs barely supporting me, and threw myself onto the couch, clutching my phone like a lifeline. But the house was no longer silent. The whispers followed me, weaving through the walls, the floors, the very air I breathed. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, their cadence mocking and cruel. Then the TV flickered, its screen filled with static, and I saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the living room, its form obscured by the writhing shadows that clung to it like a second skin. Its head tilted unnaturally, and though it had no face, I felt its gaze pierce through me. I tried to run, but my body wouldn't move, frozen in place by an unseen force. The figure began to glide toward me, its movements jerky and unnatural, like a puppet on strings. As it neared, the whispers grew louder, drilling into my skull until I thought I would go mad. Just when it reached out, its shadowy hand inches from my face, everything went dark. I woke up sprawled on the floor, the sunlight streaming through the windows, warm and inviting. For a moment, I thought it had all been a nightmare, a figment of my imagination amplified by the isolation of the night. But then I noticed the scratches on the walls, deep and jagged, and the faint sound of breathing coming from the basement door, now slightly ajar. It began as an ordinary evening, one of those nights where the world outside seemed to vanish into the comforting routine of solitude. I was home alone, a rare opportunity since my family rarely left me behind. The silence was almost luxurious, the hum of the refrigerator and the occasional creak of the old wooden floors the only sounds accompanying me. The house was dark except for the glow of the TV in the living room, casting dancing shadows on the walls. At first, I reveled in the solitude, but as the hours dragged on, something in the air shifted. The stillness became too thick, too suffocating, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. Dismissing the paranoia as childish, I leaned back into the couch, scrolling absent-mindedly through my phone. Then came the first noise, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere above me. My heart skipped a beat, but I reasoned it away. Probably a tree branch brushing against the attic window or the wind shifting the eaves of the house. But when the tapping turned into deliberate, almost measured knocks, the hair on the back of my neck stood up. I muted the TV and sat frozen, listening. The knocking continued, moving across the ceiling, like someone or something was crawling directly above me. Gathering my courage, I grabbed a flashlight and decided to check it out. The attic had always been a creepy, neglected space, filled with forgotten furniture, dusty boxes, and the occasional family of mice. As I climbed the rickety pull-down ladder, each step felt heavier, as if the air around me was thickening. The attic door creaked open, revealing the familiar but unsettling clutter bathed in the narrow beam of my flashlight. I scanned the space, my heart pounding. Nothing seemed out of place. Just as I was about to descend, the beam of light caught something, a handprint, smeared and greasy, on the dusty window at the far end of the attic. It was too large to be mine, and it definitely wasn't old. Panic set in, but I tried to convince myself it had always been there, overlooked in the years of clutter. I returned downstairs, locking the attic hatch behind me. Back in the living room, I tried to distract myself with the TV, but the sense of unease refused to leave. The shadows on the walls seemed to twist and shift, forming shapes that vanished as quickly as they appeared. My phone buzzed, and I almost jumped out of my skin. It was a text from my mom, just a casual check-in to make sure everything was okay. I considered telling her about the attic, but I didn't want to seem paranoid. I typed back a quick "all good," and as I hit send, the power cut out. The house plunged into darkness, leaving only the faint glow of my phone screen. My breath caught as the silence deepened. Then I heard it, the sound of footsteps coming from upstairs, slow and deliberate. I stood rooted to the spot, every instinct screaming at me to run, but curiosity and fear kept me frozen. I grabbed a kitchen knife and began to move, the flashlight on my phone trembling as I ascended the staircase. Each step felt like an eternity. The footsteps stopped as I reached the top, but the air felt alive, charged with an unseen presence. I checked each room, finding nothing but darkness and the unsettling sensation of being watched. Finally, I reached my bedroom. The door was ajar, though I was certain I'd closed it earlier. I pushed it open slowly, and the beam of light landed on my bed. What I saw made my blood run cold. There was an indentation on the mattress, as if someone had been sitting there moments before, but the room was empty. A faint whisper echoed behind me, unintelligible but unmistakably human. I spun around, knife raised, but the hallway was empty. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what was happening. Was I imagining things? Hallucinating? I decided to leave, to get out of the house and call for help. As I reached the front door, I found it wouldn't budge. The locks were frozen in place, unyielding despite my desperate attempts to turn them. My phone screen flickered, then went black, leaving me completely cut off. Then came the laughter, soft and guttural, emanating from the shadows. It echoed through the house, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. I backed away, retreating to the living room, and there it was again, that rhythmic tapping, now louder, coming from the walls themselves. It wasn't random. It had a pattern, almost like a code, as though the house was trying to communicate. The air grew colder, and my breath fogged in front of me. The laughter turned to whispers, countless voices speaking in overlapping tones, filling the room with a maddening cacophony. I covered my ears, but the sound seemed to pierce through, growing louder and louder. Suddenly, the TV turned on by itself, the screen showing static. Amid the noise, a face emerged in the static, pale, gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to stare directly into my soul. It spoke my name, its voice a distorted growl, and the screen shattered. Glass sprayed across the room, but I didn't feel the impact. Instead, I felt a hand close around my ankle. I looked down to see a shadowy figure, its form shifting and amorphous, pulling me toward the floor. I screamed and kicked, breaking free and scrambled backward. The figure melted into the darkness, but the whispers remained, growing louder. Every shadow in the room seemed to come alive, reaching for me with claw-like tendrils. I ran, locking myself in the bathroom, the only room with no windows. The whispers followed me, seeping through the cracks in the door. The light flickered, and the mirror began to distort, my reflection replaced by that same hollow-eyed figure. It grinned, its mouth impossibly wide, and whispered, "You can't leave." I screamed, pounding on the walls, praying for it to stop. Then everything went silent. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the bathroom floor, the lights steady and the house eerily quiet. Felt like hours had passed, but my phone showed only a few minutes. I cautiously opened the door and found the house exactly as it had been. No shattered glass, no scratches on the walls, no sign of the shadowy figure. But as I stepped into the hallway, I saw something that made my blood run cold. A single greasy handprint on the mirror, and the faint sound of laughter echoing in the distance.